Let's bring into the conversation retired Marine intelligence officer and co-host of the STRAT podcast, our friend Hal Kempfer. Hal, good to see you. Thanks so much for being with us here. So, Hal, before we get into my questions here, I want to put up this live picture we're getting out of the West Bank at the moment. Take a look at this. This is quite something here, because we have been seeing these pictures over the last, now, 6 days. And this is live here. And this, from what I understand, this a Red Cross kind of charter bus there is ferrying now free and released Palestinian prisoners from Israeli jails back to where they came from before they were incarcerated, Hal. This is quite something. Let's just play out as well if we can see or hear any of the sound on the ground there. Okay, so Hal, if you could, from what I understand, this is in Batsunia in the West Bank. What are we looking at right now?
Well, there's a large number of Palestinians, detainees, and prisoners that have been released. Many of them were arrested or taken to custody in the West Bank. And so what they're doing is they've released them and they're returning them. It wouldn't make much sense if someone is from the West Bank and their family's from the West Bank, they live in the West Bank, to send them to Gaza because there's simply nobody there. Now, what we have seen in the news so far, we've seen with the video that's been released from the IDF and other sources, has been that we see the Palestinians that are being released going to Gaza, reunifying with their families. But now we're seeing the West Bank. Now, one thing I will tell you is that there's been a number of confrontations, in some cases deadly, in the West Bank, and a lot of heightened tensions right there. The West Bank's kind of been on lockdown since October 7th. And so there is a volatile situation where, events like this could spin out of control depending on what happens. So I'm sure Israeli authorities are looking at this very closely, as are the Palestinian Authority, to make sure that this thing stays controlled, that this reunification goes peacefully. Right now, it looks like it's pretty calm. I don't see some of the things we've seen in the past with more violent demonstrations in the West Bank, but you just never know. And certainly Israel is on leaning forward to see what's going to happen in the West Bank, because they're afraid they might have, they have a southern front. They were afraid of a northern front with Hezbollah, but there's always been the talk of, well, there could be a third front, and that would be in the West Bank. But so far, that hasn't really manifested itself.
Yeah, Hal, I'm kind of curious, too. What do you think the likelihood is that these Palestinian prisoners that have been released as part of this deal, you and I talked about, who they are, what their complexion is. You said a lot of them are very young individuals, minors. Some of them are women as well. What's the likelihood that they might be repeat offenders, so to speak, if they might end up back in an Israeli prison? Do you foresee that happening?
Andrew, I think you're asking the exact same question that Israeli forces, the Shin Bet, has been asking too, which is how many of these might go back to doing violent extremist things that in many cases what got them arrested and incarcerated in the first place. I would not be surprised to see some of them pop up at some point in the future, engaged in violent activities, particularly in the Gaza Strip. It's if you actually look at the leadership in the Gaza Strip of Hamas, many of them have spent time in Israeli prisons. We saw the same thing in Iraq, where some of the, for example, al-Baghdadi, the leader of ISIS, was in U.S. custody for quite some time, as were other senior ISIS leaders. So it does often happen that you'll have them in custody, you release them, they go back, and in many cases, their mindset is more radicalized than when they actually went in the first place. So it is very, very possible. However, with that said, Israel was very careful in pre-vetting everybody that they are returning. They went through and they looked at a lot of different criteria to pick the first 300 that they were going to allow to return. And I'm sure one of the criteria that they looked at was the chance of recidivism, if you will, that they could end up, in this case, not necessarily getting reincarcerated, although that's very possible, but they would return to their prior, things that got them incarcerated in the first place.
Yeah. Hal, I don't know if you could offer anything on this, but that green flag you see waving there, that's not the Palestinian flag we've seen time and time again in many of these protests here stateside. From what I understand, correct me if I'm wrong, is that a flag that designates Hamas loyalty and support? Is that the Hamas flag, if you will?
I believe it is. Yes,
Okay.
I believe it is. Yeah.
Okay. I just wanted to clarify that.
The green flag, the black flag are common. Often with the black flag, you'll have the Shahada, which is basically a phrase, one of the core phrases within Islam, which is not radical, certainly in and of itself, although that has shown up on other radical flags across the board. But I believe that is a Hamas flag. I've got to tell you, I could be wrong. But I believe that's a Hamas flag.
Okay. Hal, let's get into the news today. 16 more people were released today by Hamas. 10 of those were Israeli. 4 of them, I believe, were Thai, and 2 were Russian-Israeli as well. So I thought that was quite interesting. One of them, though, was a dual Israeli-American citizen. And so now you've had 2 American citizens released out of all of these hostages. We heard from the Israeli government spokesperson today, 86 hostages have been released. And so this is quite something. Although this is kind of a morbid and macabre stat here, 2 of those 86, Hal, were murdered in Hamas custody and captivity, and then were brought into Israel there. So I thought that was quite interesting. Let's talk, though, about some of these claims, though, by Hamas, Hal, especially about this very, very young family. You sent this over, that the IDF said it was looking into a claim by Hamas's Al-Qassam brigades today that 3 individuals from a family were killed after terrorists kidnapped them on October 7th. Some of their family members have been out in front of television cameras on shows talking about whether or not they believe Hamas's claims. The IDF came out with a statement, Hal, said this. They said the terrorist organization Hamas continues to act in a cruel and inhuman manner. IDF representatives spoke with the members of the Bibis family, informed them of the publication, and are accompanying them at this time. The IDF is checking the authenticity of the information. The responsibility for the safety of all the abductees in the Gaza Strip lies fully with the terrorist organization Hamas. Now, Hal, this is 2 children and their mother. Hamas says they are dead. They are not among the living hostages here, leaving the father of the family so heart-stricken. And just, you can't even imagine what he's going through, getting this conflicting information as all these hostages are being released. What are we to make of this?
Well, it's a confusing situation. On the ground, of course, you recall, we've already had 1 hostage released that earlier had been reported as dead. So that was good news. This is incredibly sad news. Of course, it's the youngest hostage. He was taken when he was 9 months old. He'd be 10 months old now. His little brother, and their mother were taken. There's video of them being taken hostage, taken into custody. What Hamas is saying is that they were killed in an Israeli airstrike. Well, of course, Hamas would say they were killed in an Israeli airstrike. That kind of goes without saying that they would try to find some way to blame Israel. That's what Israel is probably investigating as much as anything, is trying to figure out where they say this happened, and then trying to connect the dots to see if there was an Israeli airstrike in the vicinity of wherever the supposed, deadly event took place. And in most cases, Hamas, as they have done with the explosion at the Al-Shifa hospital, they simply just make something up and blame it on Israel, and that later turns out it was something that they did. And in this particular situation, there's a lot of concern that they may very well, sadly, be dead, but they may have also been killed by Hamas or one of the other groups that's taken hostages, and it may be a homicide. And that's a very distinct possibility. That, of course, would be a war crime on top of a war crime. And of course, Israel would like to find out everybody that was responsible, everybody that was in contact with them, the entire chain of command, because at some point there will be some sort of judicial action after this war is over to deal with Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and other groups that were involved in the entire hostage taking and everything else that took place.
I mean, Hal, we're talking about a 10-month-old child and a 4-year-old child. And this is just the reality, the horrific nature of this entire process. And I would be remiss if I didn't say it does seem on day 6, Hal, that this is somewhat becoming mechanic and routine about this deal. We've been showing you these pictures, our viewers, each and every day over the last 6 days. The Israeli hostages released, then the Palestinian prisoners released, and it's become, somewhat quotidian, but it's not. It's very, very serious. This is life and death here we're talking about. And I just want to read from the statement, Hal, that President Biden, the White House, put out on the release of the latest tranche of hostages. Live now, look there at the White House. President Biden said this: today, 16 more people have been returned to their families after being held hostage by Hamas for more than 50 days. Among them is Liat Beinin, a high school teacher, a guide at Israel's Holocaust Museum, Yad Vashem, and an American. Jill and I are deeply gratified that she will soon be reunited with her 3 children and her father, who have been racked with worry for her safety. And we remain determined to secure the release of every person taken hostage by Hamas during its brutal terrorist assault on Israel on October 7th, including Liat's husband, Aviv. The deal to pause the fighting in Gaza and facilitate the release of hostages, a deal the U.S. worked intensively to secure, sustain, and extend, is now in its 6th day. This deal has delivered meaningful results. Nearly 100 hostages have been returned to their loved ones, and the U.S. has led the international community to use this pause to accelerate the delivery of additional humanitarian assistance into Gaza. More than 200 truckloads with aid, including food, water, medicine, shelter supplies, fuel, and cooking gas, have entered Gaza each of the last few days. And for the first time since this conflict began, aid reached northern Gaza. Hal, that's really interesting. And we can talk about, I guess, the elephant in the room. The big looming question is whether or not, Hal, the extension will be extended even further. You have one Senate Democrat, Peter Welch from Vermont. He's calling for an indefinite ceasefire. Obviously, what that means is an end to the war itself entirely. So I think this is really interesting. We spoke with an IDF spokesperson earlier today, and he told us that an extension, possibly by as much as 4 or 5 days, could be on the table, Hal. It just so matters whether or not Hamas agrees with that, and Israeli officials can agree with that. So it seems like both sides are open to an extension. They just got to work out the details and hammer those out, right?
And, Andrew, it's interesting. Last night, you and I had talked about extensions. The possibility of a 4-day extension was definitely out there. 5 days would be, it's not, certainly I can't rule out that it could go for 5 days. It does seem like there's tremendous momentum, and the Qataris are very optimistic that there will be some sort of extension for 1 to 2 days. That does seem more likely than not that it's going to occur. However, I would temper all this discussion. There is tremendous pressure on Bibi Netanyahu and within the Israeli government to get the war going again. And one of the things, if I can give you certainly give you a perspective. I mean, Hamas would love to see this thing go into a ceasefire where Hamas survives, regardless of the devastation and damage in Gaza. They would say, we survived, we did this big attack, and we're still in charge, and we're still there. That is completely unacceptable to Israel. Israel has stated very clearly, unequivocally, that the destruction of Hamas is certainly as equal a priority as getting the hostages back. And so with that, it really politically, it's almost impossible for the Netanyahu government to not go in there and finish the job with Hamas. For them to stop and do what they've done in the past is just, it's kind of inconceivable. But with that said, I do think the extension could happen for a few more.
Okay.
One of the things, though, on the back end of that extension, if I may say, is they're running out of women and children. And Hamas has gone out there and said, okay, we're going to work a new deal for men and particularly anybody in the military. And their new deal is they want to up the ante, not the 3-to-1 ratio, but something much higher.
Okay.
The last ratio they had for that was 1,079 to 1. That was the one they did for a sergeant. So that in and of itself, if they go in with that sort of thinking, that could be something that puts more momentum on the war kicking off sooner rather than later.
Yeah, I mean, Hal, though, time is of the essence. It's going to be ending here very, very soon. And so hostilities will resume, presumably. And so I just want to show you and our viewers this soundbite, Bibi Netanyahu coming out today, telling us what the resumption of the war is going to look like, the resolve the Israelis have. Let's listen.
בתחילת המלחמה אני קבעתי 3 יעדים: חיסול החמאס, החזרת כל חטופינו, ולהבטיח שעזה לעולם לא תחזור להיות איום על ישראל. 3 היעדים האלה עומדים בעינם. בשבוע האחרון אנחנו השגנו הישג גדול מאוד: החזרת עשרות רבות של חטופינו. לפני שבוע זה נשמע דמיוני, אבל השגנו את זה. בימים האחרונים אבל אני שומע שאלה: האם לאחר מיצוי השלב הזה של החזרת חטופינו ישראל תחזור ללחימה? אז התשובה שלי היא חד משמעית כן. אין מצב שאנחנו לא חוזרים ללחימה עד הסוף. זו המדיניות שלי. הקבינט כולו עומד מאחוריה, הממשלה כולה עומדת מאחוריה, החיילים עומדים מאחוריה, העם עומד מאחוריה. זה בדיוק מה שנעשה.
Okay, Hal, so you heard there quite in strong language, and this has been Bibi Netanyahu's line the entire time up until the ceasefire started and during the ceasefire as well. They plan to continue their operation in how they decided to root out Hamas. Now, there's this pretty, I thought, stunning report in Axios today. Biden administration officials have kind of cautioned the Israeli government to not let northern Gaza look like southern Gaza right now. Do you think that's going to hold?
Well, yeah, I think what you meant was don't make southern Gaza look like northern Gaza. But yeah. Exactly. The devastation of northern Gaza is just horrific. One of the challenges, and we talked about this when they announced that when they were saying evacuate northern Gaza, was where do they go? And of course, initially they go to southern Gaza, but at some point they have to prosecute south. And in order to minimize collateral damage, the loss of more civilian lives, they were going to have to move that population out of harm's way, which meant, and they kind of hinted at that today, which meant moving them back into northern Gaza. Well, northern Gaza, as you can see from this video here, is an absolute mess. There is no place for them to move right back into. What they left, for the most part, has been destroyed. It's just simply no longer there. So how are they going to move 2 million people to the north to get them out of harm's way? That's going to be an enormous logistical challenge. And I don't know if they've worked out all the mechanics on that. So a few more days, if I go back to the previous question, a few more days to work on that probably wouldn't be bad from an IDF planning standpoint because of the logistics involved. But they still have a lot more prosecution of terrain, particularly urban terrain, particularly subsurface terrain, that they need to work on. And I think that's going to, the northern campaign is not done. They've got quite a bit more time doing war fighting. They're also going to be doing some probably more, they've been pretty targeted so far in the south, but I could see more direct action stuff with raids going into the south and particularly into the subsurface areas in that tunnel complex. So that's something that they're going to have to work on. One interesting thing that did come up on this, though, and I believe it might have been President Herzog that brought this up. They were asking him, why does the Hamas want to release all the hostages? And he went to the tunnels and he spoke about the tunnels. He said the reason they don't want to do it is because they know that once the hostages are all out, that we're going to destroy the tunnels. And he alluded to flooding them with seawater and filling them with inflammable materials and basically burning them out, if you will, wiping out the tunnel system in a fairly rather overwhelming fashion, if you will. That was the first time I have heard that. But now that it's said, I'm sure Hamas had factored that into their thinking as well, which just tells me that they're going to try and probably hold on to some hostages longer, particularly looking at the Southern campaign, to keep them in there, to keep that element of doubt as to where the hostages are in order to prevent Israel and the IDF from doing some things underground along the lines of what was alluded to.
Yeah, of course, we were just showing some of the pictures and video of these, massive convoys of aid trucks as well. You're taking a live picture there. This is in the West Bank, as scores of Palestinian prisoners have been released as part of the hostage deal as well here. Also want to put up this tweet from the IDF, just kind of capping off the news of today, saying 10 Israeli and 4 Thai hostages have just been transferred to the ICRC to Egypt and are currently on their way to Kerem Shalom crossing, where they will be received by Israeli security officials. The hostages' families are being updated by IDF representatives, and you watched that all unfold live. Hal Kempfer, we do want to take a quick commercial break. If you could just stick with us. We have one more top story we want to ask you some questions about it. But, of course, we're also previewing Secretary of State Antony Blinken's trip to Israel tomorrow. He'll be meeting with Israeli President Herzog and Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu as well. So we will see everyone in 2 minutes. For more here on Live Now from Fox.